Okay, so hi everyone and welcome to another episode. This time I'm here with Tim, Mr. Timothy Wright. Should I say your full name? Timothy Sean Wright.
I think Tim is okay.
Tim is okay from Elite. And we're gonna talk, roughly I wanted to discuss a bit about how post-colonial societies and like the kind of like fiction genres that come out of them, both in literature and film. And I kind of wanted this to be a bit different from just post-colonial fiction or literature itself because that's a bit different. And because we're with Tim here, we're gonna discuss vampire fiction from post-colonial societies. But he's gonna talk more about that. But before that, Tim, would you like to give us an introduction of yourself?
Sure. So the short version is I'm from South Africa. I did my undergraduate degree in architecture in South Africa. Then I went to the US, got my PhD in literature. Then I went back to South Africa. And I somehow ended up in Turkey. But I'm busy working I'm working on a book about kind of genre fiction, speculative fiction and fantasy in 21st century Johannesburg. So I'm kind of interested in the particular kinds of genres that have emerged in contemporary Johannesburg. One of the chapters in the book is on vampire fiction in Johannesburg, so I have a particular interest in that. And I've done a bit of research on African vampire fiction more generally.
That enough?
So that's my intro.
Okay. So maybe when we're starting, would you want to recommend any type of like literature or film, or I know that you talked about like a graphic novel in the article itself.
So there is a graphic novel that's extremely hard to get hold of. So I don't know if I can recommend it, but it's great. It's called Rebirth.
Okay.
And in fact, I think I lent it to someone in the department because last night when I was thinking about this podcast, I went looking for it so I could browse through it and I can't find it anywhere. And then I have a vague memory that I may have lent it to one of the students.
Oh.
Good so I don't know where it is now.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's very hard to get hold of this book. The other thing, there's on YouTube, there's now a version of a very weird movie that I write about in the chapter called Pure Blood.
Okay.
That's on YouTube. It came out in 1999. It's a very strange movie, but it's kind of fun, and I think maybe if you're a bit high, you could kind of enjoy it. It's that kind of movie.
Amazing. Okay. I think if you're throwing in vampire recommendations, you can also throw in more pop culture. You mentioned that in one sentence in the article.
So I think there are a lot of there's just a lot of great contemporary vampire stuff. My favorite vampire fiction, I guess, is the film version of Interview with the Vampire.
Okay.
With Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, and that's from the 90s. It's a classic 90s film. It's great.
I still haven't watched that.
Highly recommend it. I also like the film version of What We Do in the Shadows.
Mm-hmm. That I've seen. Although I watched it as a kid, so I watched it as a kid, so I didn't like understand anything about what was actually happening. But yeah.
But what I like about that is it's I kind of deal with this in my book chapters. It's like a comic take on vampires, which is a little bit unexpected, but from a certain perspective, vampires are actually hilarious creatures.
Yeah.
You can make a lot of fun of them. So I think that's a kind of potential in the vampire figure that people have only discovered recently.
What is your like least favorite vampire?
Oh, I hate to say it, but it's Twilight. It's really, I think it's just deeply unimaginative and sad, and it's just the vampire is just clearly like a fantasy of a certain kind of it reminds me of 50 Shades of Grey. It's the fantasy of this like ultra dominant man who's so powerful that you can't even have him.
Wait, I'm pretty sure I'm not getting this wrong, but 50 Shades was a fan fiction of Twilight, was it not?
I don't know. It could have been.
Because
I feel like a whole lot of dubious ideas about female fantasies of male sexuality come out of Twilight.
Probably.
So that is my least favorite.
I don't know if it's anyone's like favorite thing. I feel like it's more of like a hate watch, guilty pleasure kind of relationship with Twilight.
For me, I've never even been able to finish the first film because for me, it's not even bad enough to enjoy. I think there's a moment with the vampire, what's his name, Edward Cullen, and they're in Washington State in this very rainy place, so he's never exposed to sunlight, and then he tells the girl, "Let me show you myself in my true form," and they go and find like a little spot of sunlight on the top of the mountain, and his skin glitters, and she's like, "Oh, you look like diamonds." And I think at that point you realize just how bad this film is.
What's your guilty pleasure watch though for vampires?
My guilty pleasure watch. I've probably watched What We Do in the Shadows too many times.
Okay, but that's not a guilty pleasure though. It's good.
It's good. I do think it's good.
There's the Vampire Diaries.
I didn't get into that. There was a TV
Buffy the
series
Vampire.
that came out in the early 2000s called True Blood that I really liked.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah.
And it's got a whole variety of supernatural creatures. So in the first season it's vampires, and then in the second season I think werewolves are added, and then in the third season they're fairies. That's pretty bad, but it's good bad.
If we're discussing like that, have you ever seen Supernatural?
No.
So it's more so about all things supernatural and not just vampires. But I would kind of want to make you watch the first season because it's a really good season.
Okay, I'll put that on my list.
Yes. Okay. But there's a few episodes on Vampire Lore and stuff too. But anyways, okay. Now to get a bit more on topic, maybe. You wanted to discuss post-colonial vampire fiction, or like vampire fiction for post-colonial societies.
Yes. So, like vampire fiction is one of the vampire is one of those. I guess it's one of those fictional entities that has globalized. So there's vampire fiction from everywhere in the world. I don't know most of that. There's an Iranian vampire movie that I watched called What We Do in the Shadows, which is kind of cool. It's not a great movie.
Okay.
But she's just wandering through the streets of the small town in Iran. And all these creepy men are following her around, and she ends up killing them and eating them. So that's all I know about vampires in the larger globe. But I do know a lot about African vampires. Okay. So that's what I can talk about.
Okay. Can you tell us a bit about maybe South African vampires, or how that entered?
Yeah, I will. So the interesting thing about that is for a long time, vampire fiction just didn't exist in South Africa. Throughout the whole colonial period and the apartheid period, when you would think people would want to be writing about vampires, because you're in a very predatory, vampiric kind of society where a small elite are basically preying on the lifeblood of this large kind of black majority. You'd think like that's the perfect arena for a vampire story, but there were no vampire stories up until I think the first one is in 1999. There's a movie called Pure Blood, and then in about 2010 there are two more vampire fictions. One of them is a movie called Eternity, and the other one is a graphic novel called the movie is called Eternity, and a graphic novel called Rebirth. So there's suddenly this cluster of vampire stories that emerge in basically in 21st century South Africa after the end of the apartheid regime, which I find kind of interesting. It seems counterintuitive to me. I do have a theory for why that is, though.
What's the theory?
One of the interesting things about all of these vampire fictions, so they're all like taking the kind of cliched Euro-American idea of the vampire as well, actually, it's not entirely true, and I'll explain why. But they're basing themselves on a kind of stereotype of the vampire that we get from Dracula and from Twilight and from the Anne Rice novels. but all the vampires in these South African vampire fictions have kind of weird differences. So I'll just uh, tell you a couple of them. So in the first film that I'm interested in, it's a 1999 film. It's set in post-apartheid South Africa, and there's a sudden vampire outbreak in the smaller town in post-apartheid South Africa amongst white people in this kind of white neighborhood. And it's because the story is very complicated. I can't explain it, but they drink this vial of vampire blood that's left over from the apartheid era. And so they suddenly start turning into vampires, but they're completely ridiculous vampires. There's nothing really terrifying about them. They're kind of idiots. They go around in this kind of zombie-like state. They seem to be of like below average IQ. They're very unsexy creatures. And I think one of the things with like the classic European and American vampires is like a sexual attraction associated with them. They're always objects of desire, or like illicit desire. In the South African vampire fiction, I look at like these vampires are they're the opposite of that. They're not just asexual, they're kind of repulsive.
Okay.
They're anti-sexual. So they kind of bumble around in this new South Africa in which black people are now running the country. And they've got this vague plan to kind of stage this white supremacist rebellion and reinstate apartheid, but they're too useless to actually be able to do anything. So I think one of the things that's going on in South African vampire fiction is it's being produced by white South Africans as a way of kind of satirizing whiteness itself, satirizing all these pretensions to kind of intellectual and ethical superiority.
So like a reversal on the other, where typically the other would be you'd look at the minorities as the other, but now you're kind of reversing that on the white itself, which is supposed to be the object of desire, but now is no longer.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, I think you should put that sentence in my chapter. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So it's this inversion where white people are no longer at the center of things. They're suddenly marginal, and in these vampire narratives, they're suddenly this object of derision. They're these peculiar, irrational, useless creatures. So I think that's exactly what it is.
I kind of wonder, like, so generally when you have maybe not even post-colonial fiction, but maybe writers or movie makers or whatever coming out of these. So there's certain types of genres that maybe more like in the subcontinent, like maybe in Indian film industry, like in Bollywood, you'd have the tropes of like rags to riches or like some version of the American dream, but obviously you're not in America. You're trying to chase that in like, how should I say that? In India, I don't want to say third world country. That's a very like.
They say the global south.
The global south. So like, do the South African vampire genres or the tropes, are they also following like a specific line of maybe a trope?
So what exactly do you mean by that?
Like, do you see like the rags to riches story or like something like that, like chasing like?
Yeah, I think there is. So there is a pattern in all of these fictions. And the pattern in all of these fictions is that the vampire figure is always ends up being kind of humbled and brought down to earth. I think that's the South African vampire trope. So the vampire is always associated with white people.
Yeah.
Although in some of these vampire fictions there are black vampires too. But it's associated with the kind of idea of whiteness, which I would say is just an idea of like unthinking centrality. We're clearly the most important people here. We should be running things. And in all of these narratives, the trope is these vampires are like brought very brutally down to earth and realize actually they are not in control of anything. So I think that's the running theme. Okay. Although it happens in very different ways in all of the things I look at.
Because one thing that we thought that we might talk about when we were discussing this was Monkey Man. I'm sorry. I want to bring Dev Patel in. And like as you were speaking, I was kind of also thinking of how it's also connecting to that. Now I feel the need to give a bit of a background.
Okay.
So, Monkey Man is actor Dave Patel's directorial debut. He stars in it, but he also directs it. It came out in 2024. And so, I checked out the movie, but I forgot to check him. Okay, no, check him up sounds weird. I forgot to like look him up.
I think he grew up in the UK, but
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, but I still thought of it as the same thing. Like, it is still someone that's coming out from like a post-colonial society, and then this is like the narratives and the stories that maybe not these people, but like that you're starting to see now is more so like against the system, very radically taking it out quite violently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a trope in a lot of contemporary Indian narrative. I'm thinking of White Tiger as well.
Yeah.
You've got this person who's like right at the bottom of society who just by sheer kind of brutality works his way up to the top. So I think one of the things that maybe connects post-apartheid South Africa and post-independence India is that they're both societies that have emerged from a colonial past and then have entered into this hyper-capitalist present. So they've got rid of one structure of oppression, but they've entered into another one. So in South Africa, for example, in post-apartheid South Africa, the levels of economic inequality are actually higher than they ever were in the apartheid era. So you have extreme wealth gaps between the people who run the country, who are now a mixture of white and black, and the people at the bottom. And I think India is the same. It's extremely unequal. So I think there's this larger framework of this kind of globalization of this kind of laissez-faire capitalism, where it's just like let the people in these newly independent countries just exploit their own country mates, and the elites can get as rich as they want. So I think that's the new paradigm.
I kind of like, you were saying similar stuff with this on social media as well, when like the tax stuff in the US, like I think they changed it a bit, or maybe it was coming out, but you had like celebrities, very, very few celebrities, but you had some celebrities saying they're happy to pay the taxes, but then there's such a big gap between the working class that can barely afford living, and then the elite who are barely even paying taxes. They're not being charged the same at all anymore.
Yeah.
And one of the critiques or comments on Monkey Man that I read was that like it's kind of taking like the political system that you see in America, and it's bringing that to like modern day India, which was interesting.
Yeah, so I think one of the strange like historical ironies is a lot of these independence movements in Africa and South Asia took place at exactly the same time as the triumph of like free market capitalism in the West. So countries were becoming independent and going out into this larger world and saying, what should we do now? We should clearly embrace this new kind of freedom that's being marketed as free market capitalism. So I think the question for post-colonial literature becomes like, what are you resisting now? Previously you resisted the colonizer, but it's not clear who the colonizer is anymore. Now there's an elite class who connected to global capital in some way or another, but it's much harder to identify the enemy. You can't just say the enemy is the British who are occupying us. The enemy is now within.
Yeah.
So I think this is something that a lot of contemporary post-colonial literature has to deal with in various ways. And I think the vampire stuff I'm writing about is also, in a way, one of the enemies within post-apartheid South Africa is this idea amongst certain factions of the white population, not all, that black people have basically screwed up the country and the white people need to be in charge again. So you see very famous South Africans like Elon Musk talking about this genocide against white people.
Wait, he's South African?
Elon Musk is South African.
I didn't know.
He's the most famous.
I kind of avoid seeing anything about Elon Musk, to be honest. Like, I just don't want to see it, so I don't look it up.
But it's very interesting because he left South Africa in the late 80s, about the same time that the apartheid regime was falling. And then he moved to the US, became extremely wealthy, and now he's suddenly very concerned about this supposed genocide against white people in South Africa. So a lot of people are arguing that Elon Musk has this deep-seated resentment that he's now finally getting a chance to take his revenge on this country that he feels didn't do him right when he was younger. Yes, so I can imagine a genre emerging in the contemporary US, which is like a version of Monkey Man, but the people at the top are tech titans.
Yeah.
I could see that genre emerging. I'm surprised it hasn't emerged yet.
I also like saw another thing. It was this one writer, and her book is maybe, I don't know who, I don't remember the name, I just saw it on TikTok. But her book is coming out like maybe sometime this year, and it is sort of about, it's fiction I think, but it's about like AI kind of entering the sphere of things and controlling everything and whatnot. And that is kind of true now, but she wrote this like 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think one theory that's always interested me is this theory. It's by these two anthropologists called John and Jean Komarov. They're a married couple, but their theory is that the global south these days is ahead of the global north. What they mean by that is that the phenomena experienced in the global south are actually the future of the global north. So extreme wealth inequality is experienced first in the global south, then the global north catches up. So I think it's interesting to think about contemporary post-colonial literature as maybe anticipating the kind of literature that's going to start emerging in places like America in the next decade or two. So that's something that interests me. I didn't realize I'm not answering your question directly, but I think there's an interesting way in which literature can kind of anticipate historical situations. And in particular, I think literature from the global south, which I think experiences these extremities a little bit earlier than the global north.
Yeah. Come back to vampires if
Yes,
you want.
we can do that. There's something I want to say.
What do you want to say?
My favorite of the kind of vampire fictions that I'm looking at is this graphic novel called Rebirth.
Right.
And it's my favorite because I think it really reinvents the vampire figure in a really clever way. There's like a contradiction within the European idea of the vampire. Because the European, at least in popular culture, the European figure of the vampire is this very masterful, self-contained, dominant entity who's like the apex predator, who's in charge of it. The humans kind of grovel before the vampire.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of contradiction because vampires depend for their physical sustenance on the blood of humans. Mm-hmm. So they're actually dependent on the people that they're kind of lording it over all the time. And the thing that interests me is that there's a deep contradiction in the vampire self-conception, because vampires tend to think of themselves as this elite, pure separate race. But at any given time, they're full of kind of various foreign bloods. So they're contaminated all the time. And the way I put it in my chapter is that we're used to thinking of the vampire as the creature that penetrates others. But in a weird way, you can also think of the vampire as a creature who's constantly being penetrated by other bloods. And I'm bringing this up because this graphic novel has a really brilliant idea. It's set in contemporary Johannesburg, and one of the things, one of the kind of tragedies of post-apartheid South Africa is that around the same time as South Africa, the apartheid regime was overthrown in South Africa, there was a massive pandemic of HIV. So South Africa has some of the highest rates of HIV in the world. I think 13% is the current rate. Now, this book is set in Johannesburg, which is a great city for vampire fiction because it's a deeply unequal city. And it's also a very atomized city. So vampires have like little fortified places where they can hide out. And they've got this huge populace of like destitute people that they can just feed on. Mm-hmm. And it's a city of 8 million people, which is huge. But then if you think about HIV pandemic, 1 million of those 8 million people are HIV positive. So if you then think about the implications of this for a vampire story, it means the vampire is suddenly very vulnerable because they have a basically 1 in 8 chance of drinking infected blood.
Yeah.
So the whole conceit of this graphic novel is that these vampires are all dying of an HIV type disease because they've all drunk this infected blood. So I was talking earlier on about how I think the trope in all of these vampire fictions is how this vampire figure is brought down to earth. And I think this graphic novel does it in a brilliant way because you get these vampire figures who are literally kind of made aware of their physical dependency on human blood because they're drinking all this infected blood, and they are dying. So they've become mortal. I don't want to go into all the details in how as to how that novel explores that, but I think it's a brilliant idea because it makes you completely rethink what the vampire is about.
Yeah.
And it makes you rethink the vampire as this fragile, vulnerable creature. And it makes you think also about the vampire's pretensions to mastery as being a whole lot of bluff.
I mean, you can. I'm not stopping you. I would love to hear about it. But as you were talking, I was also thinking, I forgot what I was thinking. Maybe like allegorical representative of like power structures in general societies anyways, or maybe like the financial divide between them. But I was also thinking of like the connection between like image and power. So how you're perceived and represented, and like the amount of power that maybe you hold, or maybe you don't, because like even in what you were saying, you know, it's seen as like this dominant kind of like in charge character, but really it's quite heavily dependent. And if you kind of apply that to like, I don't know, our societies maybe.
Yeah.
Mine, or like, you know, like what we see in like films and stuff. Like I'm gonna mention Monkey Man again because it's the only example I can think of right now. It's kind of the same. You have this kind of like perception of, or like the image of power.
Yes.
But maybe you're actually dependent. And then I also connect like all of this very directly to race or like racism in general.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right.
But all of that, like even a bit in like our previous episode with Tan, I kind of talked about this. We talked about it and how it's all about like perception and face and like color. In his, like, my thoughts were very scattered, so I quite literally said like, I don't understand racism. Which of course, like, I don't mean that I don't understand the concept of it. I kind of just don't understand how people are capable of it.
Yeah.
And like in this same thing, it's kind of like the image of you, like even like look at Nosferatu.
The new one. Or
Yeah.
the old one.
Well, I've seen the new one.
Okay.
Have you seen the new one?
I have seen the new one.
Did you like it?
I did like it, but not as much as the old one.
Okay, I'll watch the old one then because I haven't seen the old one. But like.
The 3.
Really?
But we can get back to that. But I like the one from the 1970s.
Okay.
With Klaus Kinski as
Okay.
Nosferatu.
I wrote it down. I think Bill Skarsgård.
So the new one with Bill
He's
Skarsgård.
great.
Yeah, that's also very interesting because that's also that's almost going back to the folk origins of the vampire in the Balkans.
Yeah.
These kind of peasants.
Yeah.
These Balkan peasants who they grows up out of their graves, and they wouldn't sensually bite your neck. They bite you in the chest.
Yeah. Ooh. I just had like an image flash of like the ending scene from the movie. But like, yeah, like even with that, you have like this, you know, it's all color, it's all look, and even if you're, I don't know, I don't understand like this distribution between like color.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I think I have to think about it a bit more, but I think you're completely right. I think part of what's going on in a lot of these vampire narratives is it's an analysis of how much racial power has to do with a certain kind of self-presentation. And a lot of vampiric power, even in the classic vampire tales, a lot of vampiric power is about this mesmerizing ability they have to get humans to kind of fall in love with them, even if they're hideous. Humans are the human victim is mesmerized by
Yeah.
them. So I think that's the case in this new Nosferatu. He's a hideous creature. There's nothing attractive about him, but he's kind of mesmerizing. So I think that's one interesting way in which the vampire figure lines up with like this analysis of power, because it's very much a projection of power. It's like, you must clearly bow down before me because I am this mesmerizing creature. And also the vampires believe in their own myths about themselves, which is part of their power.
Power is almost entirely from like stories and myth, and it's not really what you actually have. Maybe it's just a perception of it, right? Because even if you in the real world, outside of the vampire world for a second, even if you look at kind of like this like fantasy around like a white person, wherever they're from, I don't care, you will always look at that and just like want to please them. You as objective here, I'm not talking about you or me, but like you'd want to like please them more than like if you contrast that with like someone who's not white.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to comment on this as a white person myself, but I've certainly, like, I've been to conferences in South Africa where black people have stood up and said, why is it that we have this automatic deference to white people? Like, we see a white person and we automatically want to please them. We automatically think they must be superior to us. They must be smarter than us. Why do we feel this way? So yeah, that's a very interesting aspect of how racism works. It's not just that it's not just that white people have subjugated black people. It's that, or people of color, let's say, it's that the people they've subjugated have somehow bought into the whole larger myth of white people being at the top of the hierarchy.
Like, of course, I'm not like excusing like stereotypes either. Like, of course, like even for like brown people or whatever, there's bad people, but bad people kind of exist all around. It's not just centered on one specific race. And generally you'd see stereotypes of like, oh, these people collectively are just like they're messy, they're dirty, they're this and that. And I'll cut this out too, but I was talking to what happens in like the dorms and stuff.
Well, that's part of the racism. I think that you can't even be bothered to learn the details because they're not really worth knowing. I mean, that was very true of apartheid South Africa. Like, black culture in South Africa is immensely complicated. There, within black South Africa, there are 17 different, tribal groups. Most white South Africans just see this as an undifferentiated mess. It's just the blacks. So I think that's part of the structure of racism.
In a fictional country, let's say, I don't really know where and how many people think like this, but it's kind of like, oh, but we're not racist because racism doesn't exist here.
Yeah, in this fictional country. This completely hypothetical country.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, I don't quite know how to comment on that. I think obviously the first step in combating racism is being able to identify it. And I think, for a long time, one of the differences I noticed between the United States and South Africa when I first moved to the United States, when I grew up in South Africa, everyone talked about racism. It was very obvious that you lived in a racist society. Some South Africans were just racist and they said, we believe in this. I had friends who would say, not friends. I knew people who would say, I'm a racist. I just believe white people are better than black people and we should live separately. But when I moved to the US, which is a very similar kind of country with a very similar racial history, very few people in the US, very few white people would even acknowledge that there was racism in the US. They would say, oh, that was a long time ago, but that was in like the 19th century. We're way past that. So I think you need to acknowledge racism before you can even begin combating it.
Instead of like placing it off as like, oh, but it's fact that they're like that, which is obviously not true.
Exactly. And I think even in the contemporary US, you see a lot of people a lot of MAGA Republicans will just say all this stuff about teaching about race and racial history. It's nonsense. It's made up. We're not a racist country. So I think you're right to isolate this as a very important part of the struggle against racism. Is just getting people to acknowledge that it exists in the first place.
I was also thinking like, I guess I noticed this more in my generation. Like you will have and I've only observed this mostly in guys. I've never heard a female say this. A female say that, I don't know. But like some guys are always like, oh, yeah, I am a racist. I identify as a racist as a joke, or maybe not even as a joke. I cannot tell to what degree that's supposed to be a joke, because I don't really know what kind of humor they're trying to achieve with that.
Yeah, I always feel like every joke has a kernel of
Mhm.
truth somewhere in it.
That's a really good saying. I saw that online.
I think Zizek said that somewhere.
Okay, yeah.
It's a way to say something that's entirely socially unacceptable.
Mhm.
You hide it by making it a joke.
Yeah.
One of the things about apartheid South Africa is that it was, white South Africans in apartheid South Africa were generally overtly racist. They would just say like, white people are superior to black people. And we can't let our gene pool be contaminated by black people, and it's just better if our two groups live separately. So there was an overt acknowledgement of racism. It wasn't a shameful thing. In a way, I think that makes it easier to combat racism now, because South Africans all recognize that it exists, whereas in other countries, that initial point of recognition has never really happened.
Bringing us back to vampires for a second. We need to like sandwich all of this information in with like not fun stuff, but like fantasy and then real life. Okay. One thing that I kind of noticed is, okay, maybe this is a mix of things, but my question will be to you about vampire fiction itself. But in like film and maybe literature too, but I know more on the film that's coming out of like, let's just say, the global south. There you do see this presence of religion in the plot, which is kind of also relying on like how dominant like the dependence on religion or like just some sort of religion is for people, and how you'd see like within the class divide, of course, like if it's a religious society, everyone's going to believe in something, but you do have lower classes depending on like religious myths a lot, significantly lot more than the elite do. And you even saw this in Monkey Man because he was like David Hill did do his take on like the guru critique, which I think we discussed this in our class as well last semester.
Yeah, so the villain in Monkey Man is an evil guru, basically.
One of them.
Who runs a cult.
That's one of the people that he's targeting. And like even in the movie, like his name was like Baba Shakti, which Shakti just means like strength or power or energy.
I can also tell you this happens in both Latin America and Africa. There's these giant mega churches.
Yeah.
Most of them are based in Brazil. There's Christian charismatic mega churches, and they go into very poor communities in Latin America and Africa, and they convince people that they must give their entire life savings to the church in order to be saved. So there are these predatory forms of religion all over the global south. Yeah. At the moment, and a lot of people are getting very rich. A lot of these religious leaders are getting very, very wealthy out of this.
Like I don't know
from the poorest people.
Yeah, I don't know much about Buddhism either, but like I'm sure. Like the thing is, there's something everywhere. There's people taking advantage of like minorities in any way, like may it be like financial or racial or whatever. They're being taken advantage of in religion. Like the poor depend on their religion because
Yes.
The lack
of
something.
Much else.
Yeah, I was trying not to say that, but like, like the way my mom says it is like, oh, it's a test. Like you have to prove that you are, and it's gonna make it easier for you in the afterlife. And yeah, like violence against minorities and like kind of integrating religion because it's such a big part of like society. That's the main essence of what I was trying to say. How and do you and if you see that play out in like vampire fiction, how?
So that's a great question, and I think I can maybe tie all of these things together. So one thing I would say is that in the heyday of apartheid, or in the heyday of colonialism, whiteness itself operated as a kind of cult. White people were this kind of cultish group who had access to elite technologies and money and elite intelligence. And the people they conquered enter in through the fringes of this group, but they could never become white themselves. Now, the way I see this operating in vampire fiction, it's very interesting. I think one of the ideas in all of these vampire fictions is that in an earlier era, vampires were the apex predator. They were the kind of dominant power. And in all these contemporary vampire fictions, the vampires are just one predatory group amongst many predatory groups. Um, and I think this kind of ties back into what you're saying, because in the colonial era, the main predatory group was the colonial regime.
Yeah.
Now the colonial regime has gone, you have certain kinds of neo-colonialism, but you have all these other new predatory entities entering the picture. So that's how I would tie it together. And they also operate in kind of vampiric ways, but they're no longer colonists. These are just, so I think these predatory religious groups are one kind of vampiric entity.
Yeah.
There are also all kinds of corrupt business dealings in all post-colonial societies. The forms of political corruption and cronyism, where political elites will kind of give contracts to their connections from the struggle era. So I think that's the connection. It's that in post-colonial societies, there are many predatory entities, and these kind of white vampires are just one of these many predatory entities, and they're not even the most significant one anymore. So it's about new forms of predation that have entered into the post-colonial world.
That's great, thank you.
Pleasure.
Do you have any other thoughts on vampires?
I have a lot of thoughts, but
do you want to share them?
But they're a bit chaotic. Maybe I don't have any other thoughts. I'm trying to think. So okay, here's maybe one final thought. It's not my idea. It's an idea that comes from Nancy Armstrong, who's a very important literary critic. She retired recently. One of the things she says about vampires is that the figure of the vampire emerges in any culture in times of major social change. And particularly in times of social change when fundamental institutions like the family are under threat. They begin to emerge in Britain in the early 19th century with the kind of Industrial Revolution. Then they really take off with Dracula, which is a time of immense modernization in the late 19th century. And the thing with vampires is that they represent this total threat to the ordinary organization of society, because vampires don't form nuclear families with a man and a woman who copulate and have a child. Vampires are totally sexually indiscriminate. They'll feed off men, they'll feed off women, and they don't reproduce sexually. They reproduce by turning other creatures. So that means that vampires, on the one hand, they are these terrifying entities that represent this terrifying change that society is going through. So societies see them as these figures of horror. Dracula becomes this figure of horror for a society to kind of manage this deep threat to itself. But another way of seeing the vampire is that they also represent alternative ways of arranging society. So there's a utopian element to the vampire. You can think of the vampire as representing some alternative to the standard nuclear family nation-state model of society. And that's an idea that I find very interesting. I'm not sure that any of the South African vampire texts I do really explore those new possibilities of social organization that vampires might represent.
Okay.
But I do think there are some vampire texts that do. There's a vampire story by Octavia Butler called Fledgling. That's, I think, from the 1990s, that explores how vampires and humans might live together in these weird non-nuclear family arrangements. So I think that's my final thought on vampires, that there is a kind of politically and culturally progressive aspect to the vampire, in which they might represent new ways of organizing life, new, less restrictive ways of organizing life, if they're not just seen as these figures of terror.
Yeah. And they're not really discriminating by anything, are they? They're not really discriminating who they're feeding on.
Yeah, well, so generally, no. Although, interestingly enough, in one of the South African vampire movies, I examine these white vampires all get together and they kidnap a child to feed on.
Okay.
but they've kidnapped a white child because they don't want to be contaminated by the blood of a black child. So it's a satire of this
Okay.
obsession with racial purity.
Yeah.
But I think in general, you could say
Yeah.
vampires are not, they don't discriminate because blood is just blood.
Yeah.
Like, blood itself has no racial properties. You can't, by analyzing blood, you can't tell if it comes from a brown person or a black person or a white person. It's just blood.
And like contrast that with like, it's supposed to be like this fantastical, is that a word?
It is weird.
Okay, we'll make it one like image of like this I don't know, mythical white figure, and then it's not discriminating.
Yes, and the other thing is that vampires don't need to be white anymore.
Yeah.
There's no need for them to be white anymore. We can
Yeah.
have brown vampires. Why not?
Yeah.
There should be more of them.
That's my next film. Is that everything?
I think those are probably all my ideas at this point.
Well, those were great. Thank you so much for sitting down with me.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a very productive discussion. I've
About
enjoyed it.
post-colonial literature and vampires.